I used to be a very like hardcore vegan, and I'm still 100% vegan. But now when I speak to other people, I'm less about telling them what to do, what not to do. What I am doing is I'm encouraging them to add sprouts to their diet. And the more sprouts they add, the better they will feel. And I had no idea that sprouts were the number one food for weight loss.
Something you said, I think I read it or you said it in another interview, but I thought it was really interesting. So when people who are non-vegan vegetarian hear that someone is vegan vegetarian and then that they're really enthusiastic about it, and you start talking about the studies and whatnot, people naturally roll their eyes and goes, well, how does they get their protein? And you said, it's not even, you're asking the wrong question. You need to be asking, how am I getting my fiber? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's actually, I have two canned responses to when someone asks, where am I getting the protein? One is like, where did you get that question? Like, are you a nutritionist? Like, where are you getting that question? Like, who is eating your mind with that question, right? Mm-hmm. But the other one is, where do you get your fiber from? You know, about 95% of America is fiber deficient because fiber only exists in plants, right? So most people, if they're not eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, they're not getting a lot of fiber, which results in several things. Number one, constipation. Number two, antacids and indigestions and acid reflux. And number three, chronic health issues. We have 2 out of 3 Americans are overweight or obese. We have tens of millions of people that are adult onset diabetic, right? We have 90 plus people that are pre-diabetic, of which more than half of them don't even know they're pre-diabetic, right? And so heart disease is still the number one killer. And so when people ask where to get the protein from, I was like, I don't even think about protein. Like I'm like, I eat, like I'm getting, where am I getting my protein from? Here, I'll give you my third answer. Every single sprout contains every single amino acid to make a protein. Mm-hmm. So where am I getting my proteins from? Sprouts.
Where you said 1 day's worth of eating sprouts, which is really only about 800 calories, is more nutrients than most people get from their diet in a week.
Oh, micronutrients, phytonutrients for sure. And also just, it's constantly evolving information. You could easily eat thousands of calories a day of sprouts. It all depends. Mm-hmm. If you're eating alfalfa sprouts, it's low calorie, right? If you're eating garbanzo beans, if you're eating sprouted lentils, if you're eating sprouted peas, if you're eating sprouted chia, you could easily get as many calories as you want. The problem is the whole notion of calories and how they translate into weight gain, weight loss, muscle, is such an imperfect science. And no one is really tracking, exactly. Like if someone really wanted to do research, you got to take people and you have to create like ankle bracelets, chow hall, limited food, full monitoring. I mean, maybe that's what you use Google Glass for, is to make sure that someone's not, doing something, you're seeing the world through their lens to get healthy stuff. So I don't know, but what I will say is, where I used to be a very like hardcore vegan, and I'm still 100% vegan. But now when I speak to other people, I'm less about telling them what to do, what not to do. What I am doing is I'm encouraging them to add sprouts to their diet. And the more sprouts they add, the better they will feel. And I had no idea that sprouts were the number one food for regulating insulin levels. I had no idea that sprouts were the number one food for weight loss. I had no idea that sprouts contained a compound called glucoraphanin that when it mixed with an enzyme called myrosinase would form sulforaphane that would have these chemoprotective anti-cancer properties. I had no idea of these things. And similar to me going all in, whether it was with graffiti or graphic design or the military, or juice, like I'm all in on the sprouts. And I'm so grateful. Like, I can't believe like the way you went all in on meditation in the late 90s and you've stayed in and you've made it your career and your vocation and your identity with that. I can't believe that sprouts were just there, like just an opportunity waiting to sprout. Like they were just waiting for someone to show them some love and put them on the map. And like, I'm going to New York next week to be on Good Day New York to talk about sprouts. Like
I love it.
It's just the beginning of like, oh, and this was sending text messages, calling, messaging. Like I go through without fear of rejection. And that's a great skill and a muscle to have that I would love for everyone to take my call. I would love for everyone to respond to my call. I'd love all my emails, text messages to be responded to positively. And if they don't, so what?
Do you believe in kindred spirits and
Definitely.
things like that?
Definitely. And I also, I've been through a lot, and there are people that become close to kindred spirits with you, and they become close to you on your ascension. And then the relationship is not rooted as deep as I would have thought it would be. And then they like disappear, go dark, as if you had as if you were a total stranger or a ghost.
What's interesting about, I think, people like you, and maybe even I'll put myself in that category, is when we disappear, it's usually because we're creating something, we're birthing something. Because every time I turn around, you're doing something amazing, profound. And that's what I'm interested in talking about during this interview. And I've done the same thing. Like I found the pandemic to be one of my most creative periods. What was your pandemic experience like?
My pandemic experience was, I was in shock a little bit, right? And the shock part came through with the post Juicero journey, and then doing years of the New York, LA, San Francisco triangle, and then going to my first burn. And then at Burning Man, not necessarily under the influence of anything, but just in the energy of all of these creative people in the desert, where there was no exchange of money, where everything was just open and people were sharing their passions. I felt like, wow, I could live in the desert. Like I felt I could live in the desert. So when I moved to the desert, which was about a year and a half before the pandemic, and I pitched my yurt, my tent in the desert, and I lived there for 3 years in the tent. And many people thought like it was crazy. But then when the pandemic hit, it looked genius.
Right.
It looked genius. Like here, like in LA, people are beating each other up over toilet paper, right? And I'm like using a bidet, soaking in the hot springs, eating my own sprouts, and like I didn't see a mask like for months. Like I wouldn't go to town. I had no reason to go to town. So I was, in the beginning of the pandemic, to me, it seemed like the Twilight Zone. Like if I ever did go to town, I saw everyone with the masks. It felt like the Twilight Zone. And I
And
wasn't,
LA was really intense at the beginning. People literally were wearing hazmat suits to the grocery store with gloves and just like the whole thing standing 6 feet apart. It was like dystopia.
oh yeah. And, getting their Amazon boxes and having like a demilitarized zone where they're
Yeah.
spraying them down and like opening them. It was really a bizarre time. But my pandemic experience was I was just doing my thing. I was reading, I was writing, I was growing my sprouts. And it was interesting that during the pandemic is when I did a lot of building at Wonder Valley Hot Springs. It
Mhm.
was something that a lot of people weren't working. There wasn't a lot to get done. So I was able to find many opportunities to build my little, I describe Wonder Valley Hot Springs, where we live today, as part of this triangle. The like George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch,
Mhm.
Esalen, and
Mhm.
Burning Man. And
Mhm.
like that's like was my vision, to have hot springs, to have like community, to have like housing, where people could come for a day or a week or a month or live here and be far enough away from the energetic field of the combative urban environment. Like where we live in Wonder Valley is 100 square miles with a population of 600 people.
Mhm.
And when I was in New York, there would be like 1,000 people on every floor in the office building. So imagine having 100 square miles, with less than 1,000 people. So
Did that idea come to you at Burning Man or when you were living in the tent for those years?
Burning Man provided a lot of influence,
Mhm.
of community, of of kind of, I know you live very modestly out of a backpack. A lot of people at Burning Man like are moving there as if they're living there forever and they're only going for a week, right? So they're
Mhm.
hauling all this stuff. For me, Burning Man gave me the possibility is like, oh, I actually can use a porta potty. Like, and I
Mhm.
was in the army, so it wasn't surprising, right? And that I didn't need, broad bandwidth all the time. And
Mhm.
there's no cell phone reception there. And you find out like, okay, the time goes by. So Burning Man for me was a, a challenging experience, like doing a 10-day Vipassana. So when I would do Vipassana, very hard, you know, not to look at people, but not being connected on the phone and not being able to know what's going on and being able to respond to things. In a way, Burning Man is a different form of dystopia because here you are where there's all this activity, all this people, all this energy, but no connectivity outside of that container.
Mhm. Were you you mentioned that you were meditating or you did Vipassana. Was that before all of this? Were you already meditating twice a day, every day, even at Burning Man, even while you were living in the yurt?
Um, I did my first 10-day sit in Tamil Nadu in 2004.
Okay.
And then I did another 10-day sit in Sebastopol, probably in 2006 or 7. And
Mhm.
since then, my Vipassana practice has been 30 minutes a day, every day, once a day. And now I do it in the hot spring.
Mhm.
So um, I, the interesting thing is it's hard for me now. I'm sitting up. It's hard to sit. The hardest thing for Vipassana was the sit.
Mhm.
Um, when I'm in the hot spring, I'm kind of floating. So I have to keep my balance. So I'm going back and forth because I don't want to sink. So it keeps me fully present in my body.
Mhm.
No phone, no technology. Like I'm just in there with the water, and it makes me feel like I'm in the womb. and the time, sometimes it takes forever, that 30 minutes, and sometimes it's really quick. But now it's such a habit for me. Like I get up before 6, I go soak, and then I begin my day. And my day might mean exercise, might mean a 5K or 10K run, in the desert, or it could
Mhm.
mean, a short, and I say short, like beginning of my Vipassana, my Ashtanga practice. So I'll do, the beginning of the series, and then I end, and then I go on with my day.
Okay. So I want to go back now, if you're cool, to the early days, young Doug. They probably called you what, Dougie or something like this?
Yo, they called me Pain.
You grew up in New York City with Beverly and Robert Evans,
Yeah,
and Andrew. Was Andrew older or younger?
older,
How much older?
2 years older.
Okay. So in the shadow of Andrew, essentially, I know what that's like. I grew up with an older brother as well. What was that like in the early days? Talk
I mean,
about your whatever philosophies or ideologies that were being circulated in your Jewish household when you were growing up in the city, and what you kind of gleaned
yeah,
from that at that point in time.
me, it's interesting because I don't talk about this very frequently. Like, in a way, it was very traumatic
Mm-hmm.
and inconsistent. And so were like lower middle income,
Mm-hmm.
and we lived in a marginal neighborhood. And my parents managed to get us on the kindness of, a private Hebrew school to go on a quasi scholarship
Mm-hmm.
from first grade through eighth grade. But we would have to take the bus there. And it was in a beautiful place. Like, now I can appreciate the beauty. It was in near Wave Hill in the Bronx. The one of the buildings was the Toscanini Mansion, overlooking the Hudson River. I mean, beautiful place with big weeping willow trees. And I didn't appreciate any of that. And we had to take one or two buses to get there, and it could be cold, wet, snowy. New York is 4 seasons for sure. And the other kids in the school, and I'm still friends with several of them to this day, and they were much more affluent. So they may be dropped off, either by the nanny or the housekeeper or the parent in a Mercedes, and we're taking the bus and having to walk several blocks to the school. And
Mm-hmm.
then in the classroom, the curriculum was half English and half Hebrew. And many of these kids came from much more religious households where they took things seriously. And we would get home, and our parents didn't, there was incongruency with the religion and what everything else. So we would get home, and maybe my father was watching sports or something, and we didn't do our homework, and we didn't, say our prayers before and after every meal. And we didn't observe the Sabbath, and the other kids would be going to temple, and we'd be going to Little League. And there just became a wider and wider gap.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't feel like I fit in. Like, these were the nicest kids, but I never really felt like I fit in with them. But it wasn't because of them, it was because of me. And I
Mm-hmm.
ended up just getting into trouble or rebelling, and not doing homework, not listening. There's another thing where I didn't wear my glasses. I was prescribed with glasses, but I didn't want to be, called four eyes. I mean, the level of, you know, um, misunderstanding and judgment and ego and confusion that I experienced as an adolescent and teenager, when I look back on, is very confusing, candidly for me. But now I see that there was a method to the madness.
You're very mission focused these days. The last few things you've done professionally have been about serving the greater good. Were there any breadcrumbs of that growing up? And or what was the idea of success in your household? For instance, in my household, my dad always talked about, you have to be an entrepreneur, you have to start your own business, blah, blah, blah. What was your understanding of success as a young person?
I don't think we ever talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I remember my mother telling me that I could, do anything. Like, she planted those seeds that I could do anything. But
no pun intended, by the way, planted those seeds.
That's right. But there was never a level of like thinking, what did I want to do when I grew up? Like, I thought, like, in hindsight, that there was potential, to do some artistic things. Like, maybe I would be an artist, and there was some freedom to do that. I went to high school of music and art. I was surrounded by artists. But some of these artists there had such incredible skill that it was daunting to me, as if I was a different species, as if their art and their talent and even their handwriting was at such a different level than mine, that it was incomprehensible.
One of your mantras today is, I'll persist until I succeed. What was your work ethic like as a young person?
If it was something that I wanted to do, then it was incredibly strong. Like, I remember the first snowstorm that, like, when I was maybe 10 years old. I remember taking the bus, going to an affluent neighborhood, and my willingness to shovel snow from sunrise to sunset, and it didn't matter how wet I got, how cold I got. And it brings up, like, I try different things. I had this idea that if I poured hot water on the snow, it would melt. But I didn't realize that it would then subsequently freeze. And bad idea.
Yeah. Well, you were also a prolific graffiti artist, right? Spraying hundreds of trains.
Hundreds of trains inside and out. But it's interesting that really goes, the other graffiti writers and artists were much more talented than I was. Like, my talent might have been my persistence of willing to go paint with anybody, any day, any time of day or night, and my ability to obtain, secure, shoplift spray paint in copious amounts, more so than anybody else. So I would find, like, my little niche to fit in, and I would do that.
You had a bit of I guess you described it as a near-death experience in one of those subways one night that kind of led to you ending up in a Army recruiter's office. What was that experience?
Boredom, right? So boredom, self-medicating through negative, questionable activity. So on a Sunday afternoon, I didn't really have any friends. There was nothing really to do exciting. So I was like, oh, I'll take a few cans of paint and I'll go paint my home subway platform. So I wouldn't be too inconvenienced with my boredom. And so as I was painting the subway trains would go by, I would stop, and without getting into the full story, I ended up getting arrested, and I ended up escaping. And then I got home, and I was bloody, I was beat up, I was dirty. I had, like, climbed down the bridge with oil and dirt, and literally looked like, Dawn of the Dead, like when I got home. And, my mother and my parents, when they weren't raging, were so sweet. And I felt so embarrassed and humiliated. But then I also felt like scared, like, oh my God, I'm now 17 years old. If I were to be apprehended at this stage for even these seemingly inconsequential crimes, I could be locked up. And that was a scary thought for me. And for whatever insight that I had, my insight said, almost as if I was in a AA meeting, I am powerless over my addiction, that I knew that I was powerless over my inability to stay out of trouble, that I was just attracted to trouble. And so that's what led me to the recruiter's office, that here I was 17. I was well aware of my intelligence. So early on, like I was aware that that I was smart and that I could do things. And I was also knew that I had no discipline and that I was attracted to, bad people, bad things, bad activities. Like I couldn't just go out to a nightclub for an hour or two. Like if I went out, whether I was drinking or partying or not, we would go out and then we'd go from one club to the next club to the next club to after hours clubs, then to after hours clubs, because like I didn't want to go into the darkness and peace and abyss of sleeping, at home in a comfortable bed at a normal time.
Okay, so you end up in the 82nd Airborne Division. What does that mean? If someone is not familiar with the Army, what does that actually mean in terms of your experience?
There are different divisions in the military, right? So on a broad level, you've got Army, Air Force, Marines, then you've got Coast Guard and National Guard, Navy, etc. Within the Army, they have different divisions and different battalions. Some are field artillery, some are tanks, and most of the military is infantry, right? Where they give you a M16 assault rifle, and they let you go. The 82nd Airborne Division was a first deployment unit where they would deploy you by tossing you out of a perfectly good airplane. And so it has a little bit more rigorous training and then a little bit more money because you're having to do higher risk things like jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. So the 82nd Airborne, there were two airborne divisions. There was a 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division. And because they're flying out of a plane and they could drop a couple hundred troops out of a plane, and hope that as they're landing, they're evading, ground to air fire, you could place infantry troops wherever you want. So, where otherwise, they're not taking you on, the A train and dropping you off on, 34th Street. So normally they would have to take buses or trucks, or boats and then land. And so the Airborne Division, they could fly over and drop you wherever they want you to fight.
People say often the Army taught me discipline, confidence, structure, but they don't really ever say how. Can you just talk a little bit about how in your experience, the Army was able to take someone like you, a knucklehead looking for trouble, and teach you confidence and discipline?
The way that the military did it for me was that they break down your ego through fear, intimidation, hard labor, and every level of abuse you can think about. So by breaking down your ego, like one thing they do, and you do this consciously, you shave your head. I didn't shave my head. Like I liked my hair. My hair was part of my personality. You get to the military, they shave your head. Then I had a big duffel bag with what I thought I would need during my tour of service. And they poured it out on the ground, and the drill sergeant is going through my personal belongings, no privacy. You don't need this, you don't need this, you don't need this. And when I looked up as to like, dude, what are you doing to my shit? I did push-ups. And unlike Light, who's doing voluntary 100 push-ups, 100 pull-ups, 100 burpees, these were involuntary. This is having a big, strong, ugly man yelling at you, give me 50 push-ups. And I'm like, huh? And the more you resist, the more they persist. Mm-hmm. So this first day in the military, my scrawny little body was doing hundreds of push-ups in the snow, cold, wet hands. Then they make you wear boots and you're running. And normally, if someone said something to me and I didn't want to do it, I would ignore them. Like I just ignored all rules, whether it was my parent, a school teacher, the train conductor. I just ignored all the rules. And in the military, failure to comply with even a suggestion is a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and could be subject to hard labor. So
which means what exactly? You're hitting rocks or?
Oh, no. Yeah. The hard labor is if you cross the line there, they will incarcerate you and put you in anything from solitary confinement to a chain gang to working on things and stripping. Like after the first day, I said, I think you've got the wrong guy. Like, I'm done. My experience of the military prior to being in the military was Private Benjamin, right? Which was a joke, right? Goldie Hawn was a joke. It was a whole joke. And there's nothing funny in the military. Like, no one wants to hear my jokes. Like, you cannot be a class clown in the military without seriously suffering.
Right.
So he looks at me and he says, there is no way out.
Wow.
And I'm like, huh? Because I'm used to finding a way out.
Right.
And he goes, there are no bars on the window. You know, the campus isn't barbed wire to keep you in. But if you leave, you're going to be a fugitive and they will find you and then you will be locked up. So you have no choice. Get the fuck out of my office. And like, that was, you know, okay. There are guys like David Goggins who like want the abuse. They want it. Like, I didn't want it. I was done. I wanted out. But I had to subject myself to, like, I grew up, I never did laundry. We never did chores in the house. I never washed dishes. And here in the military, you're constantly like, everything that you have is exactly as the guy next to you.
Right.
They would give you a chart that showed you how your socks needed to be rolled and stored, how your underwear needed to be folded. So if you were to open up everyone's like little
foot
locker, they would all be the same. You'd have to make your bed tight and like as if they dropped a quarter on it, it would bounce up.
Right.
And this was madness, but you really don't have a choice. So you just suck it up. And then if you suck it up and you do it long enough, it becomes a habit and it effectively and ostensibly breaks down that ego. And that's how you learn discipline.
I love that story. Can we fast forward along now a little bit? And so you're out of the military, you're now disciplined, you're now confident, you're now working in graphic design, and you decide to go to Paul Rand's house in Connecticut. So talk about the moment just before that. Like, what gave you the confidence to go to Paul Rand's house, and he was 70 years old, one-man show, and offer to volunteer your time for indefinitely?
I mean, one of the things you learn in the military is that we're all equal, right? You know, I'm sure there's racism and prejudice in the military, and I experienced a little, but what you really learn is that everyone has to take off their pants, you know, one leg at a time. You have to poop, you have to do things. It's a very humiliating but open, heart-opening experience as you're with other like-minded souls or not like-minded souls. You're there. But the idea that someone was higher than me in the hierarchy, whether it was, you know, a business tycoon or an artist or someone else, like, to me, everyone was just equal. Like, I could talk to anybody. Like, I had no fear of speaking to someone. So I had never heard of Paul Rand until I went to Barnes and Noble in Union Square, and I found his book, one of his books on graphic design, because graphic design was, in my opinion, a legitimate vocation based on something similar or analogous to graffiti. It's like, oh, a logical progression, graffiti, graphic design. And so I called Paul Rand. I got his phone number from the Type Directors Club, and he answered his own phone. And he was like, well, what do you want? And I was like, I was a graffiti writer. I want to become a graphic designer. I'd love to meet you. I want to show you my portfolio of my work. And he was marginally polite. And then after several phone calls, he said, okay, next time I come into New York City, you know, I'll give you a call and I'll meet with you. And then like several weeks went by and he never called. And then there was a sighting of Paul Rand at one of these art director clubs or something else. And someone had mentioned that Paul was there. And this infuriated me because I felt so like that this man had given me his word that when he was in New York, that he was going to call me and that we were going to get together. So I called him up. I said, Mr. Rand, I understand you were in New York yesterday and you didn't call, so you must be really busy. I'm just going to have to come to see you. And like, you know, in many cases in Paul's relationship, he was always like part in shock and part mortified by my behavior, but he also loved me. So like, I just, you know, I told him I was coming and he didn't say not to. And I made my way to his house. And I remember sitting like on a stool, almost as if I was a spectacle. And his wife was sitting there watching the interaction with me and Paul. And he's sitting in a comfortable chair. I'm on the stool. His wife is in a different chair. And I'm sitting there for like 3 hours. And at one point I said, excuse me, Mr. Rand, may I use the toilet? And he looks at me and he looks at his wife and he goes, go shit in your own house. And like, he was just playing. And I was like, no, okay, I'll just hold it in. And I didn't have to take a shit. Like, I just needed to pee, but it was just like he liked to play. And when I did call him, when I did talk to him of why I wanted to work for him, you know, for free indefinitely, was he taught the master's program at Yale, which had like 25 students. And all of those students would leave that program and go work at like the biggest corporations or the biggest design studios. And they would all go on to become something. Like, it was very hard. expensive program to get into. And I didn't have an undergraduate degree. So there was no way I was going to the program, nor did I have like whatever it cost $100,000 a year to go to Yale at the time. So I was funny. I said, Mr. Rand, the close, because I said, I really want to learn from you. He goes, I teach at Yale. And I said, well, Mr. Rand, the closest I get to Yale was I go to the Yale Club near Grand Central and I eat hors d'oeuvres on Thursday. And he just laughed. And I said, look, I don't need the money. I've got money. I just want to work. I'll do anything. And so part of the salesmanship was my willingness to do whatever it took to be, around, Paul.
What was your commitment, your time commitment for your self-imposed internship?
It could be anywhere from 30 to 80 hours a week.
Wow. So you were making money with your regular graphic design job?
A little on my regular graphic job, most on like side hustles. Like I would busboy in an after hours club. I would work security in a nightclub. Like I would just do other things in order to make money so that I continue to spend time with Paul. Like it's hard to imagine, but it's like every minute that I was with Paul felt like it was like heaven. Like it was, he was such a genius, and like he was such a deep thinker. And we would always have really complex conversations. And he would talk to me about his other complex conversations or business issues or design issues or his curriculum. So I was exposed to this mind of this genius. And there was never 2 days that were the same. And so that's what made what I thought I didn't know where I went. I went there open-ended, not knowing what was going to happen. But at some point it was just like, oh, that's my habit. Like this is my Karate Kid wax on, wax off moment is with Paul. And the more I was with him, the more I appreciated his work and who he was. Like in the beginning, I didn't really understand his graphic design. Like it was so simple that to me, it's like, a novice criticizing the Matisse blue paper, cut paper things, thinking like, oh, that's so simple. Anyone could do that, not realizing the thought process. But as I started to see how Paul would take a design challenge and really seek to understand the business, the audience, the CEO or the entrepreneur, and look at this art problem as a business problem that needed to be solved using graphic design, that was incredibly fascinating to me. And I had a front row seat of this, this genius, and who's working with other geniuses. And when I met Paul, he was right in the mix of doing the next corporate identity for Steve Jobs. So I'm like right in there and seeing how, Steve would make his requests, how Paul would do his things, how Steve was then pushing it. And as genius as Paul was very focused in what he would do. So Paul did the logo and then the type. But then when it came to the advertising, Steve went to Ralph Amirati, who did the BMW ad campaigns. So the original Next ad campaign was, very similar to a BMW campaign. And Steve had multiples, I don't know how many, of the same BMW. Like that was his vehicle. And he had, multiples of the similar cars, but he loved the BMW experience. He loved the Porsche. He loved to drive. And he appreciated the quality and the nuance, which to me, I had never been in a BMW and I couldn't appreciate it. But hearing Paul, and because of my naivete, whatever Paul told me to do, I would do. And almost invariably, whatever I did was wrong. And I would have to keep doing it over and over and over again. And I can send you a link to some artwork where Paul would send me, like I have copies of faxes where he would send them to me at 2 a.m. And there was one follow-up where he sent me a message when he goes, you must be dead or something because I didn't respond fast enough, to his changes. Hold on, I'm going to see if I can find this. Just bear with me a second.
While you're looking for that, there's an anecdote about Paul Rand that I love about Paul dealing with Steve Jobs. And apparently, he showed him the design for the next logo and Steve wanted options. And Paul says, I don't do options. My job is to solve your problem. You can use it or you don't have to use it, but I'm not going to give you more options. Were you there for that?
Yeah, I was very close to that. As a matter of fact, you can find an interview that I did in 1993 that I posted on YouTube with Steve Jobs, where I'm interviewing Steve and he described that experience.
Oh, wow. That's you interviewing him?
Me interviewing Steve.
And is that on YouTube or is that
that's on YouTube.
On an article? Okay.
No, that's on YouTube. I think I posted it sometime in 2000 and
we'll link to it in the show notes for those who are interested in checking that out.
Yeah, one second here. Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, wow.
I had seen a lot of his work, but didn't know too much about him. And when we were starting our quest for what our corporate identity was going to be, a person that we had in-house gave me a few of his books and articles to read. And I got up to speed on who he was and the immense body of his work, which I wasn't familiar with at the time.
Was he the first designer that you approached?
He was the only one we approached. He said he'd love to do it. So he came out and visited us several times at Next and got to know the company and the people. And I think solved a very difficult problem for us. The problem he solved was generally, most companies have their logo as just a logo type. And every once in a while, a company has a logo that's sort of a little jewel, a symbol, that can be used independently of the logo type. And at Apple, we had such a symbol. As a matter of fact, at Apple, it was very rare because the symbol was the name of the company. It was a thing that had the same name as the company in Apple. Our challenge was that usually it takes, 10 years and $100 million to associate a symbol with the name of the company. Our challenge was how could we have a little jewel that we could use without the name to put on the product, et cetera, without spending, $100 million in 10 years to make that association in the customer's mind. And Paul solved that by making us a little jewel that had contained in it the name of the company. And I think that he really approached it as a problem that had to be solved, not an artistic challenge for its own sake.
What was he like to work with?
Paul's a gem. I think he personally kind of works on perfecting the exterior of kind of a curmudgeon. I think he's perfected it to new heights, actually, and it's all sort of I think it's his way of dealing with the part of the world that he doesn't necessarily want to deal with. I found him to be extremely bright and really have a heart of gold. I sort of, when I think of Paul, I think of a sort of a slightly tough exterior and a teddy bear inside. But in particular, working with him, he is one of the most professional people I've ever worked with, in the sense that he'd thought through all of the formal relationship between a client and a professional such as himself. Obviously, very deep thoughts about this. And therefore, he had very clear conclusions about what the relationship meant to both parties and how it should be conducted. For example, I asked him if he would come up with a few options. And he said, no, I will solve your problem for you and you will pay me. And you don't have to use the solution. If you want options, go talk to other people. But I'll solve your problem for you the best way I know how. And you use it or not, that's up to you. You're the client, but you pay me. And there was a clarity about the relationship that was refreshing. And again, really obviously the result of thinking about that relationship for many years or decades. And it was evident in several types of things that came up throughout the relationship. Paul's a phenomenal thinker, and I mean, he's a phenomenal
Genius.
Yeah, so I thought, like, to have that from the, like, Walter Isaacson in the Jobs biography uses this as a quote. Like, he's referencing this interview that I did with Steve. Like, it goes back that far. So it was really, part of history. And like, there's no, there was no way that I would have met Steve other than that, at that time, right? Just wasn't an option, so that was, really good times. And I have something else which is kind of funny. Let's see. So these are faxes that I got from Paul that are really funny. Let me just, where you learn things. Let's see. Now try screwing this one up. Like, and look, this is 6:15 p.m., right? 18:15, 6:15 p.m.
So he's helping you out with your own logo? Is that what that is?
Yeah, helping me out with my own logo. And then I got another one. Hold on one second. Let's see. Your typographic skills are less than minimal. So it was something that there was a true love. Like, he knew I could handle it, so he would pour it on.
I love that. I love that story. I love that relationship. And he ended up passing away, obviously. So at this point in your life, you're working with a true master, right? Meanwhile, you're eating the standard American diet.
That's right.
And everything that comes along with that. Your family's starting to have some health challenges. So let's walk us through what that experience was like leading up to you meeting Denise.
Yeah. So watching water boil happens really slowly, right? So everyone around me was eating cooked food, processed food, meat, chicken, fish, dairy, Chinese food, soul food, pizza, Italian food, Greek food. Like, we just ate. Like, the idea of food was somewhat a reward system once I became financially quasi-independent, where I could afford to eat in a restaurant. And like, I wasn't eating in Michelin star restaurants, but I could afford to go to a steakhouse, or I could get a hot dog in the street, or I could go to a nice Chinese restaurant, and we just ate. And then the first kind of clue that something was wrong with the diet was when my aunt got diabetes, and we were told that they were going to have to chop off her feet below her ankles, like a double amputation. And for me, I guess I was just around 30 or so when that happened. Like, it's incomprehensible to me to envision what it would be like. Like, now we could see, like, guys like Stephen Hawking had incredible lives, using his brain and little things with little faculty. And there's people at the time, for me to just think about someone close to me losing their feet was a very, very hard thing to process. And then ultimately she died of complications associated with diabetes after the amputation. And then my uncle died of heart disease. And then my other uncle died of heart disease. And then my mother got stomach cancer and died. And it was like within 3 months, like I thought maybe she had an ulcer or had something else or whatever, like a kid who doesn't want his mother to die is thinking, but we were in definitive denial that she was dying. And she like went downhill and she died. And then my father died of heart disease in the same hospital as my mother. And then my brother, who was less active than me, my older brother, ended up becoming overweight, obese, having the first of 3 strokes and a heart attack. And then I met Denise.
At a nightclub at 2 a.m.
At 2 a.m, yeah. When I was still like just out there, not wanting to go home. It's like that movie Repo Man, like where could we go next?
Okay. And she tells you about this funny type of diet.
Yeah, I mean, Denise was vegetarian going vegan.
Mhm.
And I had never heard of vegan. And I had known vegetarians. It was really powerful for me. I just did, a class with John Robbins, who wrote Diet for a New America. And someone had given me his book like 10 years before I became vegetarian or vegan. And I opened up the book and it talked about all these atrocities to the animals. And I closed up the book and I stored it on my shelf with the book cover spine on the inside. So you would only see the paper because there was something haunting in the words of those book, in the words of that book that I didn't want to read. That was, the expression, the blinders on, the cognitive dissonance of not wanting to know. And so I could continue life as it was without having to face the atrocities that I was directly or indirectly participating in.
Mm-hmm. And then how did this lead to you co-founding Organic Avenue with Denise?
I really was attracted to Denise.
Yeah.
And we ended up spending a lot of time together. And then we became a couple. And Denise was working as a speech language pathologist at United Cerebral Palsy. And so she had her heart was into helping people. And, she was very loving, very compassionate. Her sister died of leukemia when she was 7. And so and Denise was commuting from my apartment in the West Village to Long Island to go to United Cerebral Palsy. And so I said, look, why don't you do something that you're passionate about? So she was exploring doing tofu cheesecakes or doing the beginning of e-commerce for different, natural products. And then I moved into a loft space in Chinatown. And in there, we said, well, maybe we'll have some potlucks and we'll invite people over. Maybe we'll have a movie night and we'll show conscious movies, Who Killed the Electric Car or the like. And when we would come over and then we would do these dinner parties, turns out the potlucks were a bomb because people wouldn't bring, high enough quality food to work. So then we said, well, maybe we'll bring in a chef. So Denise went to the Raw Food Festival in Oregon and recruited top raw chefs to come. And then we would have dinner parties. And then, we learned about juice. We learned about raw food. we started to buy products. So when people came over, they could take some product with them and go home. And then that became the genesis of Organic Avenue.
And you were operating the whole thing from your loft in Chinatown, correct?
Yeah, for a couple of years.
Yeah. So
Until we had so much inventory and no foot traffic. The only time people could come is when we invited them or had an event or something. And then, like, to me, we had more inventory than it cost for rent. So it made sense, like, oh, we'll get a store, and then work in the store, and then you could get foot traffic and be available and make it a thing.
Right. So I this is 2002, and the idea of opening up a store in Manhattan, it seems very costly. What was your financial situation at the time? How were you able to make that happen?
I mean, I was always working, always saving money, and like very calculated. Like, I remember we furnished the store with furniture from IKEA, right?
Okay.
We bought like the absolute necessities. Like, we went to the garment district and we found some glass shelves and racks, and we found like a handyman to help put them together, and we sanded the original wood floors, and we did things in a very scrappy entrepreneurial way.
I remember the beautifully minimal orange branding. Did you design that?
I did not. A different Rand student did.
Interesting.
I didn't have the talent, and he was really not very good for my confidence regarding my design. It was good for my confidence in execution, but not in the design. So I found another Rand student, friend of mine that I trusted, who did this every day, that I thought would be able to embody, what Paul would think was good.
Right. And this was your first exposure to sprouts. You mentioned in the book, the sprout guy would come and deliver the sprouts from upstate New York.
Yeah. Yeah, we got that. And I was probably, exposed to the sprouts a little bit even earlier than that in the Union Square Farmers Market. But we would get the sprouts delivered and wheatgrass delivered, by some guy named, Harley. It was just, so such a, a seemingly different lifetime. When I think about how many years ago, like 2 decades, over two years ago, seems like a long time.
And you said that business grew 100% a year, and you exited and 10 years later. So were you financially sort of quotes free at that moment in time, where you could pretty much do whatever you wanted to do?
I mean, to a certain extent, everything is relative. For my lifestyle, yes, right? Because I could buy raw food. I could go where I wanted to go, and I never got hooked on the trappings. Like, I didn't want debt. I didn't, need, like, to me, fancy cars would be more anxiety. Like, where are you going to park them? Now you're going to have to get a garage. What if someone scratches them? So, like, I really think, the automobiles were not designed for utility as much as they were for ego. And so I didn't want to be stuck in that trap. Like, I had an aversion to the trappings of fancy and material things, even back then, whether I could afford them or not.
Right. And then there was the Juicero era, where it was a 5-year-long thing. You kind of glossed over that in the book. What do people get wrong about Juicero?
I mean, what they got wrong was that it was all the writings and all the things were all about a mockery of Silicon Valley and a mockery of me and this expensive machine that you could squeeze the pack by hand. When in fact, I had 10 years of making juice by hand, right? using semi-mechanical advances to make juice. So
Right.
I knew a lot about making juice. And one of the observations that I had was that unsweetened green juice, or even green juice that was sweetened, was the best possible, healthiest beverage option one could have other than spring water. And if you look at the alternatives to beverages that people could have, beer, wine, soda, energy drinks, highly processed juices from concentrated that were pasteurized, or making fresh juice in a juicer. So anecdotally, people who had a home juicer were maybe using them once or twice a month. But people who had an espresso machine were using it once or twice a day. And you could say, well, you could just go buy a bottle of juice from the grocery store. So it turns out that there is a federal law that makes it illegal to sell raw juice over interstate lines or in retail. Like if you're selling juice on a shelf in a supermarket and you're not making that juice in that store, it must be pasteurized, which means they are either cooking it to kill the microbial activity by 5 million to 1, or they're putting so much cold pressure on it to kill all the microbial activity 5 million to 1. So for me, as a raw vegan, I wanted raw juice. So we resisted doing the processed pasteurized juice. So my insight was that the way you make cold pressed juice was that you take the produce, you triple wash it, then you dice it, slice it, grind it, shred it, so that you're opening up all the cell walls of the fiber so that you then can put into a piece of cheesecloth and then separate the juice from the fiber. And if you couldn't squeeze juice out of the pack by hand, then there would be something wrong with that pack. It had to be. But the fact was, it was mostly fresh cut produce and maybe some free liquid. But if you think about the dexterity and faculty of these hands in combined with your eyes and the senses, you could easily wring it, but you'd have to invest 2 minutes into wringing it like you would a towel.
Mm-hmm.
And I, of course, as well as anyone who was in the juicing business, and we could go watch a little video of Norwalk Juicer and you could see their process. And the Norwalk Juicer was $2,500. At Organic Avenue, we started with one Norwalk Juicer, then we got a second one and a third one and a fourth one and a fifth one. And those would cost $2,500 each. And so my vision was, if you bought a Norwalk for $2,500, you still had to buy the produce, wash the produce, make the juice, then clean the juicer. So the idea was, if you could take the product of the grinding, shredding, putting it into a cheesecloth bag, and then the patent said you take that cheesecloth bag with the produce, you put into another bag that has a spout, you could then insert that into a Juicero press, or if you wanted to spend 3 times the amount, put into a Norwalk press, and it would press out the juice. And so that was the idea of Juicero. And what happened was, if we were creating a solar farm and raised $100 million, no one would even write a press release. If Starbucks was creating a new coffee grinding plant for $100 million, no one cares. When you get a guy from New York who is running a lemonade stand and he goes to Silicon Valley and big investors, Google and Kleiner Perkins and big people invest, then all of a sudden you're on the radar. You're just on the radar. and you have a target. And so then a series of mistakes, good things happen. So this is the great part about Juicero. I came up with an idea that was creative, out of the box, had never been done before. I wrote some patents, so we got 40 patents. I hired a bunch of teams. I went to Canal Street. I had a Chinese kitchen place that I knew from my Organic Avenue days build me my first prototype so I could take the produce, put in cheesecloth, put in a Ziploc bag, put in my early Juicero press, pressed it, and you were getting the best juice ever. There was very little between the first machine I made and the 20th version that shipped. And then I went to Silicon Valley and I raised $120 million. And then we hired 50 engineers, 9 food scientists, quality experts, 12 PhDs in electrical engineering and packaging and firmware and software. And, I'm not patting myself on the back, but we sold thousands of machines. We sold over 1 million servings in our first year. The business was doing $1 million a month and growing. And so from my perspective, I was like, wow, that was really great. Now, I made some mistakes. And one mistake was I wasn't meditating enough. I was working 7 days a week. I was still, listening to everyone on the board as if they were my drill sergeants, wanting to please them, etc. And then when they suggested that the company bring in a new CEO, who was the former chief operating officer of Coca-Cola, and the way they painted that picture was very glorified. Like, Doug, you can design the trains, he'll make them run on time. He knows about leadership and raising capital and building teams and scaling globally and retail and all of these things. And I was like, if you guys think this is the right thing to do, then I'm on the team. I'll agree with that. And to all founders out there, when you are a founder CEO and then you are no longer the CEO, you're just a founder, it's possible that all of your authority can be removed and you become like a figurehead and something just off in the side. And to me, that was the beginning and the end of the company. And 9 months later, they shut Juicero down, much to my sadness, and much to what I learned is that happened for me. I'm not a victim. No one made this thing come up and put a gun to my head. These were the decisions that I made based on my prior historical trauma, my military experience, my design, and my opportunistic and my desire to please, and my not taking breaths, and me just wanting to work and follow this path. And turns out, that was a decision that I made that should have required more thoughtfulness and more reflection. And Juicero got composted. And what emerged from the compost was this idea for sprouts.
Was that revelation relatively immediate, or did it take some time for you to get there? Maybe another one of those Vipassana trainings or something, in order for you to really embody that sense of, hey, this happened for me and not to me?
I mean, it took probably years, and I'm still processing that.
Okay, that's honest.
So I'm still processing that. I think at the time it was more shock. Like,
okay.
One day, I was pouring my heart into this every day. And like whatever, whatever the advisors or the board were telling me to do, I was doing. Like, I could be combative. But in this case, with the board, I was never combative. I was so agreeable because we were doing things that were defying gravity, like, at every step of the way. Like, what we launched, was an incredible product. And, the greatest part, I'm glad we're circling back to that. The greatest part of that story for me, the Juicero experience, was my original vision was that people used an espresso machine once or twice a day. People were using their Juicero machine once or twice a day. And the people who were drinking soda, energy drinks, processed juice, coffee, who will never drink cold pressed green juice, they weren't our audience, and they were the haters. And out there was much more of them than us. And unlike what I'm doing now with launching a movement for Sprouts, I had, a few hundred followers on Twitter. I had 3,000 followers on Instagram. I had no presence. All of my, sales and all of my work was focused on recruiting people to the company and raising capital. So I did not have an outward facing community aspect to anyone to defend anything that I did. And so the misinformation that was out there relative to Juicero was beyond my wildest dreams. Like, I couldn't believe that legitimate media organizations were telling half truths and exaggerating them and could be so out of integrity. Like, I had never experienced that Machiavellian malice. Like, I never heard because of my meditation and my lifestyle, like, I don't read the newspaper. I don't read like the gossip parts. So I never even understood the notion of clickbait. It just wasn't in my stratosphere. And that just, drove things. But if they got anything wrong, which was your question, and this was a long, circuitous answer, people thought Juicero was about the money and that it was about fake. And what I can say is it wasn't about the money, and Juicero was real as anything and had its great utility. And what it was for me was an opportunity to close the gap of fresh produce, that the US dietary guidelines were recommending that people consume 7 to 13 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. And the average American was consuming less than one. And that one serving that they had could have been French fries. So to me, the idea to make it easier for people to have a fresh, raw, unpasteurized juice without setup, without cleanup, even if it costs a lot of money. Like, who cares? Like, we live in a society where you can fly to Mexico on Volaris, on United, on NetJets, a private jet, what have you. And that same flight from Mexico City, to LA could cost $69 to $69 a second if you were flying a charter G5 to go there. And people have the right. So the fact that the juicer was expensive, the version 1 was expensive, like, we weren't forcing people to buy it. Like, the people who bought it loved it. And but it's just that it was such an education to understand how you could be doing all the right things. Like, if anyone would have asked me what could go wrong with Juicero, I would have said someone could get sick. You're doing raw produce, you're doing raw juice, you're on the fringe of non-pasteurizing part, that someone could get sick. And like, if someone gets sick, that's really bad. Right? I never would have thought it would have been like some farce of a financial escapade that would bring the company down. But that's so when I saw that, and I was just on the phone yesterday with a major entrepreneur, executive investor. And we were talking about Sprouts, and we were talking about Juicero. And every aspect of Juicero he loved. he's like, I loved my Juicero. I loved using it. I love the convenience. I love the design. Doug, you did a great job. And for him, in my mind, because of all the evisceration in the media, like I thought like I should duck my head in the sand and never come out. And then there are people who I respect who loved the machine, who loved the product, and were like, oh, Doug, it's not the critic who counts, it's the man who gets in the ring. So when I realized like I got in the ring, I actually did a really good job for my first time in the ring in Silicon Valley, right? Going from, you look at my career, I was a graffiti writer, then I was a paratrooper, then I was a graphic design intern, and then I did some different jobs. And then I ended up, running a juice bar, which is pretty low tech, although I did program the website, I did design spreadsheets to manage the logistics where we could do thousands of deliveries a day and our e-commerce stuff, but it was still like low tech stuff. We weren't really inventing things. But then to go to Silicon Valley and actually invent something that was a combination of hardware, software, packaging, fresh produce, connected things, like this was a lot of brain expansion part, new materials, stretching my imagination and my brain and my skill set exponentially, simultaneously in multiple directions, and recruiting and capital raising and investor relations. And, who trains you how to run a board meeting? It's not like I went to Harvard Business School and had any training whatsoever. So the fact, like, I went there and I look at it and I go, wow, in the whole scheme of things, like, I'm pretty proud of myself. Like, my ego's not out of control. The business was shut down. Clearly, I was responsible for everything that happened. And now, if I get to do something else, look at those lessons. Like, I read a lot of books. I didn't read the lessons of how to prevent these things. Like, I read different lessons of what to do, but everyone's life journey is different, and the circumstances of which they're exposed to are different. So the best thing that you could do is be influenced by what other people are doing, but then really reflect on my own experiences and see how could I apply them to whatever I'm doing next.
So speaking of which, I mean, it sounds like you're very, and maybe the general public did not realize this, but how mission focused you actually were, because, our mutual friend Amanda from Moon Juice, she kind of had the same thing. She got caught up in that sort of the perception of, oh, this is for the affluent, so let's make fun of it, let's stereotype it, let's caricaturize it. And so when you get caught up in that, then it becomes about something completely different than what your original purpose is in relationship to all of that. And you're asking this question after the fact, which is what would serve the world better at a fraction of the cost of a Juicero machine, even though that is at a fraction of a cost compared to a Norwalk machine, which obviously the media ignores. But what were the answers that came to you, and how did you land on going all in? Because I don't know anybody who's more in on Sprouts than you are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you and I went to Air One together, but I know we've both been probably in Air One in the same day, in the same year, in the same store. So on one of my last trips to Air One, I filled up a big, Yeti-like cooler, an Arctic cooler, 60-liter cooler, with all this prepared gourmet, raw vegan food, fresh produce, etc. Fill up the cooler, come out to Joshua Tree, come out to Wonder Valley Hot Springs, I go into my yurt, and like, I'm fine. Like, I've got the Milky Way, I've got the hot springs, I got the stars, my yurt, I feel grounded, I don't have I don't have a cement floor in the yurt. It's, it's like I'm grounded. And the next day, as I go into the cooler, the ice packs are melting and the food supply is dwindling. So I go onto my phone. My favorite app was Happy Cow. Go anywhere in the world, go to Happy Cow.
Sure. Yeah.
And I do vegan, nothing. Do vegetarian, nothing. Do veg friendly, nothing. And like the things that were close to me were Del Taco, 7-Eleven, Burger King. And then when I used Google Maps and I ultimately found the Whole Foods in La Quinta, was like an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half away. So I suck it up. I get in the car and I'm like, this is not why I moved to the desert, to be driving all this distance. So that night, I'm soaking in the hot springs, looking up at the stars in the Milky Way. May or may not have been hallucinating, and seeing every star twinkling into a sprouting tail. And I'm like, no, really? Wow. And I'm getting this download from the heavens, from the skies, from the universe, that number one, sprouts were vegetables. Number two, those vegetables contained every micronutrient, phytonutrient, polyphenol, bioflavonoid, antioxidant, amino acid for complete proteins as mature vegetables, all in the sprouts. And number three, sprouts had medicinal properties. I had no idea of that those medicinal properties were backed by thousands of published white papers by top universities and scientists around the world. This was just coming to me like, oh, sprouts were medicine. So the next morning, I'm really excited. I go online and I see that there's many more options in 2018 than there were in 1999 to 2002. That now you could get alfalfa, azuki, arugula, radish, clover, broccoli, chia, mustard, fenugreek, all sorts of lentils, all sorts of peas, all sorts of strains of hemp seeds that would sprout in their hulls. And I was like, wow. So within a month, I've got 6 jars in rotation, and I'm growing thousands of calories of vegetables in days, not weeks, months, or years, for like under $1 a serving, AKA pennies a serving. I'm feeling light, energetic, alive, satiated, bright and clear. And I'm like, wow, this is too good to be true. Like, this is unbelievable. Within a month, basically, I'm eating sprouts.
What was your go-to meal? Because, you're a guy, and we like the systems and processes, doing the same thing, the thing that works. What was your go-to meal back in those early days with the sprouts? Or were you just grabbing a handful of them and stuffing them in your mouth?
I mean, I had a rotation of jars going, and I would, take handfuls of these and originally just eat them raw out of the jars. So I was sprouting garbanzo beans. I was sprouting green peas, lentils, alfalfa sprouts, broccoli sprouts. And then I would get these salad mixes and protein mixes. And I was just rotating these. And then I had these little terracotta trays, and I was growing chia and flax sprouts in there for my omega-3s. And I would just eat, like, I also intermittent fast. So I only eat between noon and, at the time, noon and 6. Now I extended my eat time until 7 p.m. And so I would eat as many sprouts as I wanted until I was content. But the absence of adding salt, oil, or sugar meant there was no overeating. Like you can't overeat sprouts plain. Like you eat them if you're hungry. And intellectually, I knew if I won't eat this in this moment, then I'm not really hungry. Maybe I'm emotionally eating, maybe I'm something else, but if I'm hungry, I would eat this. So if someone's hungry and you gave them a head of raw broccoli, they'd eat the whole thing. They might even bite your fingers off. If they're carrying extra weight and they're, eating for pleasure and they're living to eat, and you say, here's some raw broccoli, they're going to be like, no way, get away from me. And that's how you know if someone's really hungry or not.
Were you thinking at the time, how do I convert this into the next organic avenue, the sprout version of this, or the next Juicero, the sprout version of this? Or what was that thinking like in terms of how do I spread this?
I mean, what I thought was, let me see what books are written on sprouting. So that's when I went online, and there were historical books written by Ann Wigmore and Viktoras Kovinskas and Steve Meyerowitz. And there were some books written about sprouts, but all of them were a minimum of 10 years old. And the approach that they took was very like earthy, hippie, niche. And having done that New York, LA, San Francisco triangle, having gone through Juicero, thinking about the mindset of all the people who would go to the Shine, like I felt like there was an opportunity to elaborate and expand on the prior work on sprouts to include my lens on sprouts, my experience on sprouts, and details of other sprouts that hadn't been written about back then, like the azuki and the radish and the clover and the broccoli. Like people weren't eating broccoli sprouts, 10 and 20 years ago. It's a relatively new thing. And so I just felt like my next step was to go to New York, leave my compound, go to New York, pitch a publisher, and basically sell them the Sprout Manifesto or the Sprout book so that we could share this information. And I wanted to be on a major publisher because I wanted the distribution and I wanted the credibility. And I wanted to, people to have access to this. And so, 2.5 years later, the Sprout book hit #1 bestseller vegetarian book on Amazon. Out of all books on Amazon, hit number 69 out of like 3 million books on Amazon on sprouts. And now
talk about the pitch though, because that was a great story. You went in there one meeting. How did you obviously your favorite book is The Greatest Salesman in the World. What do you say to get a publisher to do a book on sprouts?
Well, for one, I let the sprouts speak. So I brought sprouts, all these different sprouts. And then I went to a friend of mine who was a recipe developer. She developed the recipes for Layla Ali's book and for Oprah Winfrey's book. Okay. And I said, I want to do recipes with sprouts that are all vegan, all raw, and 50% are sprout based. And so she worked with me on the recipes. We found a friend of hers who was a chef who prepared the various dishes, and I grew the sprouts, and I went in with this sprout smorgasbord. And the editor was literally eating out of the palm of my hand. And she said, Doug, how big do you think the market is for sprouts? How many people are sprouts? Like I've heard about sprouts, they were in like the Woody Allen movie, Annie Hall, hippies have them. And I was like, you don't understand. Like sprouts solve so many problems. Like we could solve world hunger with sprouts. So many, there's 19,500 cities in America. There's only 500 Whole Foods, right? And the majority of those Whole Foods are in LA and New York and in Texas. So you probably have 19,000, 400 cities that don't have a Whole Foods in it. And that, people don't have access to organic vegetables. So the fact that you could grow your own sprouts in days for pennies a serving, without soil, without sunshine, without fertilizer, everyone needs to know this information. Like, this is sovereignty, this is independence, this is food equality, food justice. And like, I was emphatic. My level of enthusiasm was off the charts. It was like I was full throttle 100% from the time the meeting began till the time the meeting ended.
Mm-hmm. So you've done a ton of interviews talking about all the benefits of sprouts, what the best sprouts are. You don't have a favorite, but broccoli sprouts have the highest form of cancer prevention, blah, blah, blah. So I don't want to go too much into that, but what I am curious about is you are prolifically posting on your social media, and I'm wondering who's helping you, who's doing that for you, or are you doing all that yourself?
Like my Instagram, broke through 100,000.
Yeah, I saw that.
And it took years. Like it took, it took years. My TikTok broke through like in 6 weeks. I went from 0 to 100,000. I got 1.2 million likes. I got 20 million views. Like the engagement was incredible. All of the Instagram stuff is basically me or my wife shooting it and just putting it out there. And
so you have a tripod, next to the sink.
No. My wife will follow, or I will get anybody who's near me to take the camera and shoot. Like,
and you go in and put the titles and all that stuff in it?
Yeah. I downloaded Rush on the iPhone so I can edit the videos, and then I post them, and I'm still figuring it out. But
are you formulaic with it? Like, I'm posting every day before such and such time?
No, I gotta feel like inspired, to have something. And then I take some feedback like, oh, wow, the video I did with, the broccoli sprouts, this one, went like, it's kind of crazy. Like over 10 of my videos on TikTok went viral with over 1 million views.
Love it.
Right. And on Instagram, like a dozen, went viral at different degrees. And so I'll look at that and say, oh, this is what this influenced people a lot. This got shared a lot. And then you figure out, and if you think you have any clue about the algorithm, because I could do the same thing that I did that worked, and it'll be a wet blanket, like a lead balloon. Like I can do the exact thing. I think I have the formula. I think I understand it, and it's like no response. But I don't care. Like I just I was like, oh, I'll just post something else, and I'll go something else. So what?
Last thing. You mentioned in the book is the Sprout book. You mentioned that your brother Andrew was your greatest teacher. Briefly, why did you say that?
Because I'm so evolved in so many ways. My brother can trigger me in a millisecond.
That's what I thought.
Like in a millisecond. And like I still cannot sit through a dinner without being triggered in 1 or 2 or 100 ways, shape, or forms. And so it's constant reminding that, like, and there's so many similarities, and it's great to have my wife, whisper to me afterwards, like, Doug, you do the same thing that you're telling him not to do. And I was like, yeah, I know, but like, I'm sorry, I just can't control myself. So that's it. It's a great practice. And I'm so glad to have my brother still here alive, kicking.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, man, for sharing so vulnerably your life. It was a pleasure and an honor to chat with you. This is one of my favorite conversations I've had in a long time. And hopefully I'll get out to Wander Valley one of these days soon, and we can hang out and soak in one of the hot springs, one of the natural hot springs.
I would love that, Light. And I would say, you were the most prepared. You did even more preparation than John and Ocean Robbins. Like you really did your homework. And it's a testament to who you are and your presence and why you're successful. And, that's what created the trust for me to be vulnerable, because I trusted that there's no gotcha. Like if when the Vice interview was, and they asked about Juicero and they're looking for gotcha, it just triggers me like, no, I'm not going to feed your desire for clickbait. But I know that you are all love, Light. You are all love. You are all heart. You're all goodness. You're all light. And as a result, why wouldn't I be open and vulnerable, with you? Because I know where your heart is.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. Yeah, when I took on the name Light in 2005, that was part of the deal. Painting myself in this corner. You can't be an asshole and call yourself Light. So you have to go above and beyond. But yeah, man, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you look good. You sound good, and I'm happy that you're out there, very, very, very much on mission. And we know that's what the world needs more of, is just people who are doing things that light them up inside. And so I'm honored to be able to call you a friend.
Anytime, Light. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.